Revised script, Sanson's after-death account. There is a question no human being can entirely ignore. What will you find in the moment your last breath happens? What remains when the body stops responding? Does consciousness disappear along with matter, or is there something that continues beyond that final instant? These questions cross generations because they touch the deepest point of human existence. And few spiritual accounts manage to address this theme with as much serenity as the testimony of Sanson, presented by Allan Kardec in Heaven and Hell. His account does not emerge as philosophical theory. It does not present itself as a hypothesis built from speculation. It emerges as the testimony of someone who crossed the invisible frontier between the two states of existence and returned through spiritual communication to narrate what he perceived. Sanson had lived a relatively balanced existence. His spiritual understanding of life already allowed him to comprehend that death would not be an absolute disappearance, but a transition. Even so, understanding an idea intellectually does not entirely eliminate the impact of living it. When the final moments of his physical existence drew near, there was no terror. There was no sensation of brutal rupture. The process began gradually, almost imperceptibly, as though material reality were slowly beginning to lose its clarity. First came small alterations in the physical senses. Nearby voices began to seem distant. The surrounding environment lost its consistency. The body ceased to be the absolute center of perception. It was as though what had once seemed solid was slowly drawing away. At the same time, a new lucidity arose. Not a mental lucidity similar to ordinary human concentration, but a broader awareness, as if something ancient and forgotten were slowly beginning to resurface. He realized he was not falling asleep in the ordinary sense. He was entering another state. This moment was not experienced as a fall, but as a gentle displacement, as if an invisible layer were slowly detaching. The body was still present, but no longer dominant. The sounds of the physical environment seemed muffled, while another form of perception grew stronger. Then came the first unexpected sensation, the presence of nearby intelligences. Even before fully understanding his new condition, Sanson felt presences around him. They were not frightening forms. There were no threatening shadows. They were calm, serene presences, whose closeness conveyed immediate security. Communication did not happen through words. It was direct comprehension, as if complete thoughts were received instantaneously, without the need for language. This perception brought a surprising calm, because fear is often born from what one does not understand. But in that instant, he was beginning to understand. The passage was not destruction. It was continuity. Consciousness remained. The spiritual vision then began to expand. There was no pain, no physical pressure, no fatigue, only an unknown lightness taking hold of his entire perception. This lightness did not mean merely the absence of physical suffering. It meant the absence of density, as if the very structure of existence had become freer. He still remembered his life perfectly. He still recognized the bonds he had left behind. He still thought of those who remained near the recently abandoned body. But everything was beginning to be seen differently, with serene distance, with an expanded perspective. In that moment, a profound discovery emerged. Thought there possessed immediate force. On Earth, thinking and doing are processes separated by time, effort, and limitation. There, it was enough to think for the thought to move. When recalling someone, the connection seemed to arise. When turning attention to a certain memory, it presented itself as vivid. When wishing to understand something, perception drew naturally closer. It was as if the mind had ceased working under the slowness imposed by matter. But alongside this freedom came another truth impossible to ignore. What one is inwardly becomes visible. In the spiritual realm, there are no social masks, no artificially maintained appearances. What each consciousness has cultivated internally manifests with clarity. And it was by observing the spirits around him that Sanson began to understand this with greater depth. Some radiated serenity, others showed disturbance, some possessed clarity, others still seemed confused. This difference did not arise from privilege. There was no favoritism. There was natural consequence. Each spirit remained close to the inner state it had built during its physical existence. Death does not automatically transform anyone. It only removes the body. Pause. Consciousness continues being itself. Memories then began to arise with intensity. Small forgotten moments reappeared. Old conversations. Simple decisions. Seemingly small attitudes. But now everything came accompanied by a new moral perception. What had seemed like detail in life revealed real weight. A word spoken with kindness showed depth. An omission revealed an unexpected consequence. A quiet gesture emerged as greater than many events considered important while still incarnate. And then Sanson understood something fundamental. The peace he felt was not an external reward. It was an inner consequence. Death had not created serenity. It had only revealed the serenity that had been slowly built inside him throughout his existence. From that first state of lucidity, Sanson began to perceive that spiritual awakening did not happen all at once. It was not like opening one's eyes and immediately understanding the entire new reality. There was a process of adaptation, as if consciousness needed to slowly reorganize itself to function in another dimension. Each moment brought new perceptions, and with them arose new understandings of what had previously seemed impossible to describe with precision. In the first moments after separation from the body, mental reflexes of earthly life still existed. Certain memories appeared with greater intensity than others. Familiar faces, voices, familiar places, and small daily episodes arose almost simultaneously, as if the entire memory were opening in successive layers. But now these memories did not come merely as recollection. They came accompanied by a kind of deeper inner reading, in which each fact seemed to reveal meanings previously invisible. He noticed, for example, that situations that had seemed trivial during life held far greater importance than he had imagined. Small gestures of kindness appeared illuminated by consequences he had not previously been able to measure. A simple act of understanding directed at someone, a word said at the right moment, a patience practiced in silence. All of this now seemed to occupy far greater moral space than many events considered relevant while he was still incarnate. In the same way, small omissions also appeared before consciousness with surprising clarity. Not as external accusation, but as inevitable vision. Consciousness seemed to become a complete mirror, with no possibility of distraction. This vision, however, did not generate torment in Sanson. There was serenity enough for him to look at himself without despair. This was perhaps one of the great differences between a spirit at peace and one in disturbance. The capacity to recognize one's own trajectory without inner revolt. Little by little he perceived that his way of sensing others had also changed. In the material world, the physical senses determine a great part of human experience. Now, however, perception seemed to happen directly through consciousness. The presence of other spirits was felt before it was even defined. It was not necessary to look in order to identify someone. There was a kind of intuitive recognition, as if moral identity were perceived before any form. This perception gave each encounter a depth different from earthly experience. There were no disguises. The inner state of each spirit manifested naturally. Some spirits conveyed instant peace. Others revealed anxiety or restlessness. Some showed serene joy, while others still seemed deeply attached to earthly thoughts. It was by observing this diversity that Sanson began to understand more clearly why death does not produce uniformity. In human imagination, it is often thought that after death everyone immediately enters a similar condition. But in the spiritual realm, this was not confirmed. Each spirit arrived carrying its own inner reality. The difference was not in religious appearance, nor in titles, nor in previously occupied social positions. All of that lost value before the real moral condition. What remained was what had been incorporated by the soul. There were spirits whose serenity showed long inner work. Others, although freed from the body, remained restless, because mentally they were still trying to stay attached to matter. Sanson noticed that some spirits were slow to accept that the body had been left behind. They continued turned toward family members, familiar environments, interrupted concerns. Many still wished to interfere in earthly situations as if they were still physically present. But the absence of material response produced anguish in them. This attachment prolonged states of disturbance, not because there was punishment, but because the mind insisted on remaining where it could no longer act in the same way. This observation brought Sanson an even deeper understanding of human life. Much of spiritual suffering is born not from death itself, but from the excess of exclusive identification with what is transitory. When a person's entire identity is concentrated only in the body, in possessions, in positions or belongings, the separation becomes more difficult. But when there is some inner preparation, some understanding that existence goes beyond matter, the transition tends to occur with less resistance. At that moment, Sanson realized something very important. Spiritual knowledge helps, but does not replace moral transformation. There were spirits who possessed intellectual information about spiritual life, yet still showed restlessness because they had not sufficiently worked on their own inner states. Knowing is not the same as becoming. True change requires repetition, not merely recognition. True preparation lies not only in understanding concepts, but in living coherently with them. This difference became evident there. Sanson then began to perceive that the spiritual world was not an empty resting place, as many imagine. There was activity. There was consciousness in motion. There was continuous learning. The most serene spirits were not still. They showed interest, clarity, participation, and willingness to understand even more. This made a deep impression on him, because it showed that the continuity of life is not merely the survival of consciousness, but the continuity of development. Nothing was closed. Death did not represent a final point. It was a passage to another stage of learning. At the same time, the absence of the body produced a freedom difficult to translate into human language. Without physical weight, without organic needs, without fatigue, thought seemed to expand with greater ease. But this freedom did not mean the absence of responsibility. On the contrary, the greater lucidity made it even more evident how important it is to cultivate one's inner life. In this state, Sanson also began to perceive the effective bonds with those who remained incarnate. The memories of loved ones did not disappear, but now they no longer came accompanied by possessive anguish. There was tenderness, moral closeness, but without despair. He understood that each person's life continued under its own laws of learning. Upon sensing thoughts directed toward him, especially sincere feelings and prayers, Sanson understood that the connection between the two planes does not break completely. Elevated thoughts create attunement. Sincere feelings reach the spiritual plane. This bridge exists, though in a different form from what many imagine. It is not a matter of physical presence as before, but of mental and moral affinity. But at the same time, he perceived that not every human thought reaches the spiritual plane in the same way. The intimate quality of the feeling modifies the attunement. That is why superficial thoughts do not have the same effect as a true prayer or a deeply sincere feeling. And as he understood this, Sanson perceived that his view of his own earthly existence was beginning to change even more profoundly, because now an inevitable question arose before him. If life continues, then what is the true value of everything that human beings consider so important during material existence? It was before this new perspective that Sanson began to review all the logic of human life. What on earth seemed central often proved secondary when observed from consciousness freed from matter. Many conflicts that had seemed enormous in life now appeared diminished. Many disputes that consumed emotional energy proved fragile before the continuity of existence. He perceived that much of human restlessness is born from the impression of permanence of what is temporary. People suffer intensely over situations they believe to be definitive, when in truth, almost everything in the material plane is transitory. Circumstances change, positions disappear, bodies age, environments transform, relationships reorganize. The spirit, however, continues. This perception did not diminish the value of earthly life. On the contrary, it made physical existence even more important, because it showed that it functions as a decisive period of inner construction. Every situation lived on Earth, even the apparently small ones, participates in this construction. A financial difficulty, an illness, a family conflict, a professional frustration, an unexpected loss. All of it can acquire completely different meaning when seen in the light of spiritual continuity. Sanson perceived that many events that in life seemed like punishment or injustice were, in many cases, silent opportunities for moral development. This does not mean that suffering in itself is desirable, but it means that suffering frequently produces conditions in which the spirit reveals what it has truly built. In moments of ease, nearly everyone maintains a certain balance, but faced with adversity, the soul's deepest contents emerge. It was precisely this that was now becoming clear to him. The small reactions of daily life had left deep marks. Moments when he chose patience over irritation. Instants when he controlled words that could have wounded. Situations in which he accepted limitations without exaggerated revolt. These quiet movements, almost invisible during life, now appeared as an important part of the serenity he felt. At the same time, Sanson perceived that true happiness does not depend on the absence of struggle. This was perhaps one of the most common illusions among the incarnate. Many believe they will be happy when they eliminate problems, when they control circumstances, or when they achieve complete stability. But human life rarely offers total stability. Something is always in transformation. Something is always out of control. And it is precisely in this imperfect environment that the spirit learns to build balance that does not depend entirely on external conditions. He observed that very serene spirits had not always had easy lives. Many had gone through great challenges, but learned to pass through them without allowing revolt to dominate their consciousness completely. In the same way, some spirits still very disturbed had had externally comfortable lives, yet remained inwardly trapped in pride, attachment, or constant dissatisfaction. This showed that the spiritual state is not determined by the amount of suffering experienced, but by the way each experience has been assimilated inwardly. Sanson then began to understand why so many spiritual traditions insist on the value of inner vigilance. It is not a matter of artificial repression, but of continuous attention to one's own way of reacting. Because each repeated reaction slowly shapes the moral structure of the spirit. A pride fed daily becomes a strong inclination. A constantly accepted impatience becomes a deep habit. A repeated benevolence also becomes nature. Everything accumulates. Nothing disappears. In material life, this is not always perceived, because the daily rhythm distracts consciousness. But in the spiritual plane, this sum becomes visible. This clarity led Sanson to perceive something even more delicate. Much human suffering is amplified by constant comparisons. On Earth, much restlessness is born from looking at others' lives and measuring one's own existence by external criteria. Who has more? Who has achieved more? Who has been recognized? Who seems to have greater control? But in the spiritual plane, these comparisons lose almost all meaning, because what truly matters is not the external scenario lived, but the inner quality built in any scenario. Two people may go through similar situations and produce very different spiritual results. One may grow in understanding. The other may deepen revolt. The event itself does not determine everything. The inner response carries enormous weight. It was then that Sanson perceived that Earth functions as a great moral workshop, not as punishment, but as a field of experience. Each incarnation offers specific circumstances that favor certain learnings. The spirit does not always understand this while living, but afterward it perceives connections that previously seemed invisible. Apparently disconnected situations reveal meaning. Encounters that seemed accidental show importance. Losses reveal necessary liberations. Delays show corrections of direction. Everything acquires another logic. This does not mean that every detail of life is rigidly programmed. There is freedom, choice, improvisation, personal response. But there also exists a greater order in which many experiences end up serving progress, even when they initially seem like mere pain. In observing this logic, Sanson felt his inner peace growing even more, because he understood that nothing truly valuable is lost. What was learned remains. What was developed inwardly accompanies the spirit. No sincere effort disappears. No gesture of true kindness is annulled. Even when it passes unnoticed by human eyes, it remains inscribed in consciousness itself. This perception also changed his view of the death of others. On Earth, separation is usually experienced as absolute rupture, but now he saw that real bonds continue to exist. Sincere affections do not end, they change condition. Physical coexistence ceases, but moral connection remains. Separation ceases to be a definitive end. It becomes an interval between different stages of the same journey. As this understanding expanded, Sanson also perceived something important. Not all spirits quickly reach this level of clarity. Many remain for prolonged periods trapped in old concerns, mentally trying to maintain earthly routines, relive disputes, or sustain old roles. This attachment creates states of unnecessary suffering, and this led him to reflect even more deeply on why some spirits awaken in peace, while others experience prolonged disturbance. The difference between awakening in serenity or in disturbance was not linked to arbitrarily granted privileges, but to the inner state each spirit had cultivated throughout its own existence. Sanson now understood with much greater clarity that death only removes the material covering, but does not instantly transform what the spirit is inside. Consciousness continues being the same, with its values, tendencies, mental habits, and accumulated feelings. That is why some awaken almost naturally in peace, while others find enormous difficulty accepting the new condition. The spirit that lived excessively identified with matter alone tends to seek, after death, what it can no longer touch. It seeks the interrupted routine, tries to continue controlling people, environments, and circumstances that have already escaped its direct action. This attempt generates frustration because reality has already changed, though the mind still resists admitting it. Sanson observed that many spirits remained for a long time trapped in this futile effort to artificially prolong material life. Some returned repeatedly to the same environments they frequented in life. Others remained mentally tied to objects, possessions, or interests that had occupied excessive space in their attention. There were also those whose greatest difficulty was abandoning old conflicts. They remained mentally trapped in offenses, resentments, and disputes that, from the material standpoint, had already closed, but which remained intense inside them. This persistence of emotional content demonstrated something profound. True imprisonment is not found in external places, but in the internal states the spirit feeds. A resentment can bind more than any physical barrier. An obsession with control can produce more suffering than many material limitations. An unresolved guilt can create prolonged zones of disturbance. In perceiving this, Sanson understood even more clearly why so many spiritual traditions insist so strongly on the need for inner reconciliation while still in physical life. Forgiving, accepting, detaching, and understanding are not merely abstract moral virtues. They are concrete ways of preparing one's own consciousness for states of greater future freedom. Many incarnate souls imagine that there will always be time later, that certain corrections can be postponed indefinitely. But in the spiritual plane, everything that was postponed remains present. Nothing disappears automatically. Death does not erase inner contents. It only makes them even more visible. This clarity also made Sanson perceive that the human notion of judgment is often incomplete. On Earth, external judgment is frequently imagined, almost like a sentence pronounced by an exterior authority. But there, consciousness seemed to play a central role. Each spirit sees itself with an intensity impossible to avoid. There is no need for external accusations when one's own inner truth becomes transparent. This transparency, however, should not be understood as definitive condemnation. What exists is lucidity. And all lucidity opens the way for learning. It was in this context that Sanson perceived the extraordinary value of humility. The humble spirit adapts more easily because it accepts learning. It does not insist on preserving artificial images of itself. It recognizes limitations without moral collapse. It accepts help. It accepts inner revision. Pride, on the other hand, tends to hinder this process. It wants to maintain control, appearance, permanent rightness, and in the spiritual plane, this attempt meets natural resistance, because there the inner truth appears with greater clarity. Sanson therefore understood that many apparently small human difficulties have enormous future repercussions precisely because they shape this inner flexibility. Learning to yield, to listen, to correct, to recognize errors, and not to make the ego the absolute center of experience are exercises that reverberate far beyond physical life. At the same time, He observed spirits whose serenity came not from absolute perfection, but from moral sincerity. They were not spirits without a past, without errors, or without limitations, but they had cultivated sufficient inner honesty to not flee from themselves. This honesty generated peace, because whoever learns to look at themselves with truth during life greatly reduces the shock of subsequent lucidity. This was perhaps one of the great lessons of that state. Peace is not born from the absence of faults, but from the continuous disposition toward transformation. As he understood this, Sanson also perceived something extremely consoling. Many spirits receive help shortly after passing. They are not abandoned. There are friendly presences, more experienced consciousnesses, spiritual bonds built over time that offer support in the transition. These presences do not always act in spectacular ways. Often their influence is quiet, almost silent, but they help to guide, calm, and facilitate adaptation. This help, however, also depends on attunement. The more closed the spirit is in revolt or refusal, the more difficult it becomes to perceive help. The more inwardly available it is, the greater the ease with which it receives guidance. Sanson then perceived that the spiritual universe does not operate through abandonment, but through affinities and laws of moral proximity. No one is absolutely isolated, but each consciousness draws near to that with which it resonates. This attunement explains why thoughts, feelings, and intentions carry such great weight. The mind is not neutral. It organizes affinities, attracts compatible experiences, and defines much of the spiritual landscape perceived. This made even clearer the responsibility present in every thought cultivated during material life. Because each repeated thought strengthens inner directions, and those directions continue after death. In perceiving all of this, Sanson was also beginning to understand that many incarnate souls waste an enormous amount of energy on concerns that will carry almost no weight before the continuity of life. Excessive anxieties over appearance, immediate recognition, petty disputes, empty competitions, and accumulations without moral purpose proved extremely fragile before the reality he now lived. What remained was something else entirely. What remained was the capacity to love without possession, the capacity to understand without pride, the capacity to act correctly even without applause. What remained was what had been incorporated into character. And it was precisely at this point that Sanson perceived a new and even deeper understanding arising. If spiritual life reveals what we are, then every day lived on earth is far more decisive than we normally imagine. With this understanding maturing before his consciousness, Sanson began to perceive earthly life almost as a permanent field of preparation, in which each day offers the spirit quiet opportunities to build what will later be revealed with absolute clarity. Nothing that seems small remains truly small when observed in the light of spiritual continuity. Human beings often imagine that only great decisions define their moral destiny, but there it became evident that it is precisely the repeated movements of daily life that consolidate the true inner structure. A word spoken with harshness or with understanding, a hasty judgment or an attitude of listening, an impatient reaction or a moment of self-mastery, a quiet gesture of help or an indifference maintained out of comfort. Each of these apparently simple choices leaves real marks on the spirit. In material life, the speed of events causes many not to notice this construction happening. The hours succeed one another. Commitments occupy the mind. Immediate concerns always seem urgent, and with this, attention turns almost always outward. But in the spiritual plane, what was built inwardly appears with inevitable clarity. Sanson now understood that no one arrives in the spiritual world different from what they truly became. That is why peace is not something granted from outside as an arbitrary reward. It is born of affinity. The spirit at peace naturally finds environments compatible with that condition. The restless spirit initially carries its own restlessness. This truth did not have the character of punishment, but of natural consequence. Just as in the material world each choice produces certain results, in the spiritual plane the intimate quality of consciousness also produces correspondences. In observing this, Sanson perceived even more clearly why so many people spend their lives waiting for an ideal future in which to finally cultivate inner balance. They wait to resolve all problems, to reach a certain stability, to conquer certain conditions, before dedicating themselves to serenity. But this serenity is not born later. It must be built during the imperfect movement of existence itself. Life never offers a scenario entirely free of tension. There will always be some kind of challenge, some limitation, some uncertainty, some adversity. And it is precisely in those circumstances that the spirit reveals what it is truly learning. That is why the value of patience became so evident, not as passive resignation, but as the active capacity to remain lucid before what cannot be immediately controlled. The value of benevolence also became clear, because often a small gesture of understanding produces invisible effects far greater than any external achievement. On earth, many are intensely concerned with appearing important. But there it became evident that true spiritual importance rarely coincides with what receives the greatest social attention. There are quiet consciousnesses that advance deeply without any recognition. There are simple people whose inner honesty builds great spiritual stability. There are discreet lives whose moral value far surpasses external appearances. This inversion of perspective impressed Sanson, because it showed that spiritual justice operates by criteria far deeper than habitual human judgments. This understanding also expanded his view of human suffering. On earth, many pains seem without immediate meaning. Losses, illnesses, limitations, and frustrations frequently generate difficult questions. But now Sanson saw that many of these moments function as necessary interruptions to shift consciousness away from excessive illusions. Not that all pain is desirable, but often it breaks dangerous automatisms, forces a review of priorities, reveals previously ignored fragilities, and invites inwardness. At the same time, he understood that not all pain automatically produces growth. Everything depends on the way the spirit responds to it. The same trial can generate maturation in one and prolonged revolt in another. The circumstance alone does not determine the result. The inner response continues to carry decisive weight. That is why every existence remains open. Every day retains real power of transformation. Even those who have erred greatly can still begin deep changes. Even those who have lost time can still reorganize priorities. Nothing is absolutely closed while there is consciousness willing to learn. This was perhaps one of the most consoling messages of that state. Spiritual life does not eliminate responsibility, but it also never closes the door of progress completely. There is always the possibility of advancement. There is always learning possible. There is always moral new beginning. This logic made hope itself far more solid. Not a naive hope based on escape, but hope founded on laws of development. No one is condemned to eternal stagnation, but no one advances without inner work either. Everything depends on the genuine disposition toward transformation. It was then that Sanson understood something profoundly simple. Death does not alter truth, it only reveals it. Pause. What each one takes is not titles, possessions, or appearances. One takes consciousness. One takes incorporated values. One takes true affections. One takes mental habits. One takes what has become a real part of one's being. And that is why every day lived on earth holds extraordinary value, even when it seems ordinary. Because it is precisely in the ordinary that the soul is formed. It is in the daily that the spirit is educated. It is in the small repeated choices that consciousness defines itself. Perhaps that is why happy spirits speak with such serenity. Not because they escaped difficulties, but because they understood the true meaning of them. And in understanding this, death itself ceases to seem like a frightening rupture. It becomes simply the continuation of a far greater journey. If this account touched something inside you, it is because there is in you that same search. Stay with us. Each testimony that follows deepens this understanding even further. Share it with whoever you feel needs to hear this right now.